The first great legacy of Rome to the history of law and justice is the idea of a republic and the political ideology of republicanism, of a free and self-governing community who lives not under a king, but preserves its self-government, its liberty, because of the virtue of its citizens who sacrifice for the commonwealth. This ideal gave way in the period of Roman monarchy to a more liberal, individualistic ideal of freedom that was embodied in the great tradition of Roman law. And Roman law is the second legacy of Rome to the world in history of law and justice. The third and most consequential legacy of the Roman Empire to the history of law and justice comes not from the Roman Empire itself, but from the spiritual movements that occurred in the Roman Empire. Most importantly, the movement known as Christianity. Christianity is born in the Roman Empire, it grows up in the Roman Empire, it triumphs in the Roman Empire. Jesus grows up against the backdrop of Roman Empire in the Near East. He is tried and convicted by a Roman governor in Judea. His disciples become apostles who will spread his message across the Roman world, traveling through the Roman roads and Roman sea lanes, through the Roman cities, and eventually to the city of Rome itself. The most important of the Christian apostles, a man known as Paul, is himself a Roman citizen. Christianity will grow up against the background of the persecution of Christians by the Roman Empire, and it will ultimately triumph because of the conversion of a Roman emperor, Constantine. And so we want to examine what Christianity meant to the history of law and justice. We can begin this exploration by, in fact, looking at some of the differences between Jesus and Paul. Differences that build on our exploration of what it means to be a citizen. Because there's a very important distinction between Jesus and Paul in terms of Roman law. And that is that Paul has the Roman citizenship. Jesus is born without Roman citizenship. He becomes a charismatic and beloved teacher in the Galilee, the region to the north of Judea. He comes to Jerusalem, where his teachings unsettle the authorities in the temple, and he is brought to trial before a Roman governor. Now, this in itself requires some historical explanation. The Romans in the day of Jesus directly ruled Judea. They claim the power to tax the land, and they claim ultimate criminal jurisdiction. But as is often the case with the way the Roman Empire operates, they leave in control some structures of local authority, local jurisdiction. And in this case, the Romans left significant local authority in the jurisdiction of the Council of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem at the temple. And Jesus, in fact, as we see in the Gospels, is charged initially before the Sanhedrin. But as we know was the case, the Roman Empire only granted limited kinds of jurisdiction to these local bodies, like the Council of Priests in the temple. And one of the most important powers that's restricted to the Roman governor himself, that is maintained in the jurisdiction of the Roman who actually governs this territory, is the right to use the death penalty. And so this is why you see in all of the accounts that Jesus is initially tried before the Sanhedrin, but because they wish to seek the death penalty, he's brought before the Roman prefect, a man named Pontius Pilate, a Roman governor who's known to us from other historical sources. And in the Gospels, we see a kind of trial that is carried out in front of Pontius Pilate, who is a Roman governor trying a provincial non-citizen. And so we see in this miscarriage of justice, this horrific show trial that is carried out, and which the Gospels seem to suggest even Pontius Pilate himself was not tremendously convinced of the guilt of Jesus. In Matthew, he washes his hands and is willing to let Jesus be killed, precisely because Jesus is a non-citizen, and he has very limited kinds of rights. And as we see, he is crucified. He's submitted to a Roman form of punishment, an execution that was often reserved for slaves and for enemies of the state. So in the trial and execution of Jesus, we see what it was like for a non-citizen of the Roman Empire and the way that they could be subject to the kinds of summary abuse of power that was used in his case. If you flash forward some decades to the career of Paul, the most important of the Christian missionaries, Paul was destined to become the missionary to the Gentiles. Although Paul was himself Jewish, deeply learned in Jewish law, and indeed for a time had persecuted the followers of Jesus, he would come to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ, and would become the most powerful and the most successful of all the missionaries who spread the gospel of Jesus as the Messiah. Now, Paul was destined to become the missionary to the Gentiles. Even though he was Jewish, he felt that his mission was to take the gospel of Christianity to non-Jews, to the Greeks and Romans who were polytheists, those who inhabited the cities of the Greco-Roman world but who weren't Jewish. And one of the peculiar features of Paul is that he's somehow multicultural. He's a Greek-speaking Jewish intellectual, but at the same time, he's a Roman citizen. Now, we don't know to this day precisely how Paul came to obtain the Roman citizenship, but it's apparent that he had the Roman citizenship from the pages of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, one of the most important texts of the New Testament, and for a Roman historian, one of the most interesting texts of the New Testament, because it recounts in its second half the travels of Paul throughout the Greco-Roman Mediterranean. And in particular, it shows us the influence of Roman administration in different parts of the Mediterranean world, even in the Greek cities of the Mediterranean world, where Paul is repeatedly abused, arrested, imprisoned, but where he can in fact invoke his citizenship in order to obtain a kind of access to civil rights, to other kinds of civil procedures. Most importantly, the book of Acts recounts how Paul is arrested in Jerusalem and brought before a Roman procurator, a Roman governor in Caesarea, the Roman governor of Judea. And like Jesus, Paul is brought on trial, charged with sedition. And unlike Jesus, Paul is a Roman citizen, and so he can invoke his citizen's rights to appeal against the unjust acts of his governor. And the book of Acts tells precisely how Paul used this right as a citizen to appeal to Caesar. And in fact, when Paul appeals to Caesar, who is at this time the Emperor Nero, he is sent by the Roman governor under guard to the city of Rome himself, where the book of Acts ends with Paul awaiting a hearing before the emperor. And so in the biographies of Jesus and Paul, we see the ways that Christianity is born out of the early Roman Empire and the ways that an individual, whether a provincial non-citizen or a Roman citizen, might have very different experiences of the Roman system of law and justice.